But first, let me just welcome everyone who's come to the session today and acknowledge that we are coming to you today from UBC campus, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And we're grateful to be able to come to you from this territory. So without further ado, let me just briefly introduce Maureen. She's a labor, human rights, and constitutional lawyer. Her book, Coding Democracy: How Hackers Are Disrupting Power, Surveillance, and Authoritarianism, which was published by MIT Press, made Wired Magazine's 13 must-read books for spring 2020 list. She's also the author of Illusions of Security: Global Surveillance and Democracy in the Post 9/11 World, published by City Lights, 2007. Maureen's work has been praised by voices as diverse as Craig Newmark, Randy Weingarten, Cory Doctorow, Andrew Feenberg, Jeremy Waldron, and Mark Danner. She's been invited to speak in many venues, including Chatham House, Virtual Futures, the Oxford Literary Festival, the London Frontline Club, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, the World Affairs Council of California, the Toronto International Festival of Authors, the Gray Area, San Francisco, and most recently, the Goethe Institute's 1-0 Society Zeitgeister Forum. Maureen's testified before Commons and Senate committees on technology and national security matters, taught comparative national security law at UBC Law School, and written numerous articles for peer-reviewed legal journals, including one on the review of the Canadian Anti-Terrorism Act, and was cited extensively in the trial judgment in R versus Kawaja. So Maureen, we are so privileged to have you with us here today, particularly at the moment in history that we find ourselves. I couldn't think of a better talk to have. So thank you, and over to you. I think you're on mute, Maureen.
Hello, Maureen, are you there? Yeah, I think you are muted.
Sorry, yeah. It's been a while since I've been on a Zoom. All right, well, thank you very much, Victoria. It's lovely to be at UBC speaking in Vancouver. And as you mentioned, Coding Democracy is my second book. And I did a lot of field research for this book. You might be interested to know that I interviewed hackers, activists, entrepreneurs, MPs, and academics from places as diverse as the Chaos Communications Camp in Germany, the Electronic Frontier Foundation and their contacts in Silicon Valley. I interviewed Cinque Stelle MPs in the Italian Parliament, the Hacker Collective XNet in Barcelona, and people at the Hacker Labs at MIT to famous academics in Harvard Law School. So there was a great deal of field research put into this book and into the thinking behind it. And as many of you may know, hackers have been pioneers in the blockchain space, creating important prototypes like Bitcoin and imagining some of the most radical solutions for distributing democratic governance and empowerment in the digital age. With their citizen allies, hackers have taken reforms into their own hands, and they have hacked not just money, but also business, law, property, banking, politics, electoral processes, and democratic decision-making itself. And in Coding Democracy, I describe a wide array of these hacker experiments underway right now and how they could fundamentally change our current political economy. By automating trust and cutting out the middleman, blockchain and peer-to-peer technology offer radical solutions for distributed empowerment, not thought possible a few years ago. Whether it's cutting out the data miner, the monopoly platform, the financier, the central bank, the legacy stock market, big music companies, law enforcement, identity authenticators, or corrupt government records offices, hackers have grasped that blockchain can allow local and virtual communities to provide whole economies of scale to each other, peer-to-peer. Hackers also see blockchain's potential for innovative micropayment and taxation systems, and they see its uses for distributed policy development and decision-making. So these hacker experiments are really quite inspiring in their potential to build democratic, decentralized, resilient, prosperity-sharing, free societies. And there's some hope that even the smallest of them might take off and become widely used through some kind of emergent effect, the way that the hacker innovation of free software took off and became the backbone of the digital world. But of course, there's also the danger equally that blockchain technology could be used to create the worst kind of authoritarian, repressive, and unequal societies. Blockchain, for example, offers the perfect possibility for surveillance, the possibility for perfect surveillance and social credit control along the Chinese model. And if the wrong values are encoded into blockchain in any way, either advertently or inadvertently, for example, centralization versus decentralization, control versus autonomy, scarcity versus abundance, surveillance versus privacy, extraction versus fair distribution, the effects can be exponential because the code will execute them. In fact, I do have some worry that this might be happening right now in the blockchain space, with states testing the waters on ideas of universal digital IDs and vaccine passports, which are essentially social credit systems. I think there's been ominous signs in 2022 for where we could be headed, with the Trudeau government's debanking of individuals who donated to a protest movement that the government did not like. And this kind of debanking or control of finances could be the heart of a blockchain social control system, if one were ever to be implemented. So deployment of blockchain is moving very fast with very little deliberative process, and it's being used to build vast, ambitious systems. So I think it behooves all of us, and particularly the engineers, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders in the blockchain revolution, like yourselves, to be careful what you build. Where our societies end up will depend to a large extent on your ethics, the adequacy of your civics education, and in some cases, your decision simply not to build certain kinds of systems. There are at least 3 very rich value traditions that I think the blockchain community can look to for guidance. The first of these, which is sometimes forgotten, but I think it's very important, are the professional codes of ethics. And there's many of these. I spoke at the Association for Information Science Professionals. I think the organization is called ASSIST last fall, and went through about 7 or 10 different sets of professional codes and how they were important in the digital age and in the political circumstances that we find ourselves in today, around the control of information, misinformation, disinformation on digital platforms. And I think that we tend to forget our professional codes of ethics. And of course, most blockchain projects are multidisciplinary. So everyone should be bringing their own deep understanding of their own professional codes to projects. And, you know, these have been developed over centuries, decades, if not centuries, and they are by no means outdated. So, for example, the archivists might have an ethical concern that a blockchain record-keeping system not compromise public access or trustworthy records over generations. The librarian might have an ethical concern that a blockchain lending system not interfere with users' privacy or free inquiry. Lawyers might have ethical concerns that a blockchain real estate system does not compromise clients' interests in bidding, transactions, and disclosures. Health professionals might have ethical concerns that a blockchain track or trace system or vaccine passport system keep individual health records private and do not override the requirement of informed, non-coerced consent. And bankers might perhaps have ethical concerns that with these new open banking platforms that are being built, they need to fulfill their fiduciary duty to their customers when making banking information available to third parties. A second important value tradition, of course, to look to is our Western democratic, liberal democratic tradition. Everyone building a blockchain system in a Western democracy should have a solid civics education about Western democratic principles. And finally, there's the hackers ethos or hackers ethics, which are the focus of my talk today, and a sort of patrimony for technologists everywhere. One could, in fact, say that hacker ethics are a translation of democratic principles for the digital age. And I would argue that building democracy out into cyberspace is the project of the contemporary progressive hacker scene and the broader hacker movement today. Let me just give you a quick history about how hacking has evolved to take on this project. As you may know, the main locus of progressive hacking is in Europe today, coalescing around the German Chaos Computer Club. But hacking didn't begin in Europe. It began in the United States at MIT in the 1950s around early mainframe computers with young programmers who developed an ethos that journalist Stephen Levy famously summarized in his book, Heroes, Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution. And broadly speaking, the central tenet of the hacker ethos is the hands-on imperative. That's the idea that one should be able to take systems apart, to study and interrogate them, to modify them, repurpose them, and share one's modifications. The hacker's ethos, with its hands-on imperative, has had a profound influence on digital tech since the early days. Hackers, as you may know, were the original innovators in Silicon Valley. They've made an immense contribution to the development of free software, that is code that can be studied, questioned, built upon, repurposed, and shared. And as I mentioned, free and open source software have become the backbone of the digital world. They run on most of the internet servers, on most of the world's supercomputers, on the New York Stock Exchange, on the platforms of Google, Facebook, Amazon, and on most government platforms also. Hackers in the early 2000s were key players in the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement, and since the early 2000s, there's been an exponential growth of the progressive hacker scene, in which citizens and hackers have been working together to guarantee citizens' privacy, to bring transparency and accountability to those in power, to realize the social and economic goals of Occupy in the digital era, and to upgrade democratic processes themselves. And of course, two of the most momentous hacker stories in the short history of hacking are those of Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, Assange with his WikiLeaks, which published leaked information about states and oligarchs that ushered in an age of unprecedented transparency into global politics, and Edward Snowden, who revealed the extent to which the US is violating privacy around the world. And in the last decade or two, there's also been a fascinating mainstreaming and institutionalization of hacking and hacking experiments in places like Harvard, MIT, and Stanford that I think underscores the rising significance of the hacking phenomenon. And this mainstreaming has garnered, of course, new respectability and resources for hacker experiments, and it's had both positive and negative effects. The hacker principles or ideas that they have been developing over the past 3 decades or so of privacy and transparency adapted to the digital age, net neutrality, free software and commons-based production, anti-monopolization, and data self-determination, and the tools that they've been developing to secure these could be as important to a new age of democracy as the great organizing principles, liberty, equality, and fraternity were to the Enlightenment era of democracy. And I'll be ending the talk today with an example of a blockchain project and how these hacker principles might apply to it, its design. But for now, I'm going to go through these at a fairly abstract level, and I'll let you think about your own projects, perhaps, and how the principles might apply. The first of these 2 principles is our privacy and transparency adapted to the digital age. Drawing from the examples of Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, the manifesto of the contemporary hacker scene, you'll hear this if you hang out at all with hackers, is privacy for the weak, transparency for the powerful. Privacy and transparency being 2 of the fundamental conditions for a functioning democracy. Privacy, which guarantees autonomy and security in one's personal sphere and thoughts, and transparency, the only antidote to misguided or corrupt governance. So where there's been a growth of surveillance capitalism and state social control through surveillance, big data, and algorithms, hackers have been developing tools for civilian encryption and privacy. And where there's been information wars that have nearly overwhelmed our democratic elections and processes in the West, hackers have fought for transparency and a fact-based reality. The third principle that I'd like to discuss is net neutrality. And net neutrality is something that really ordinary users tend to take for granted because it was built into the original internet when it was created. The net was neutral in that the basic protocol did not do anything but send information between servers. It was a decentralized network of networks with a default mode of interoperability. It did not monitor or discriminate against content or users. Anyone could participate, move around it freely, speak and associate freely, and use it for their own purposes. In short, there were no gatekeepers. Hackers' fight for net neutrality is a fight for the future of free communication. As hackers would underline in the digital era, if you expect to decide freely what you listen to and watch, received, send, publish, create, or even think as a citizen, net neutrality is essential. Net neutrality is also about the future of media. Which media outlets survive, what stories get told, and which are suppressed. It is a fight for innovation and free markets because an information economy depends on unfettered access to the internet. And it's a fight about political freedoms because political speech and organizing are increasingly taking place through the internet. So where there's been commercialization and sequestering of the internet and the introduction of censorship and gatekeeping, hackers have tried to ensure net neutrality, decentralization, and interoperability. Those are sort of a constellation of ideas. Now, the fourth principle I'd like to discuss is free software and the related idea of commons-based production. And of course, hackers have been proselytizing the value of free software for some time now. Free software meaning software that can be scrutinized, modified, built upon, and shared without restriction. And that doesn't mean that hackers can't charge for their services or for the initial creation or modification of software if someone's willing to pay. But it does mean that once free software is released, there are no restrictions to it. That means that once you acquire free software, it is in your control. You can fix it, adapt it, study it, pass it on, reproduce it, improve upon it. And this idea that code should be in the control of computer users is really a bedrock principle of freedom and democracy in the digital age. But of course, some companies want to prevent this. They don't want users to be able to study their code. They want to keep it in a kind of perpetual black box. They don't want users to own their code when they buy it, but to be perpetual renters of the code. This, of course, is more profitable. And they don't want users to fix the code in things that they own, from fridges to giant tractors, because this is another opportunity for profit. Digital restrictions management regimes, or DRM regimes, that put locks on code and make it a criminal offense to tamper with them, deprive computer users of control over their computing and really of their property rights. And hackers have argued, turn consumers into literal serfs of those corporations. So where there's been proprietary closed code and a huge shift of property rights to software owners through digital rights management locks and related laws, hackers have fought to end DRM practices. And they have also, time and time again, proven the superior quality of free software, of open software, code that can be studied, questioned, built upon, repurposed, and shared, and commons-based production, which is a component of free software. Now, the last two principles, anti-monopolization and data self-determination, I just like to say that where platform monopolies are killing local economies, hackers have innovated ways of breaking these up through alternative platforms and business models that we could potentially build a whole new economy around. And where companies have been colonizing humanity's data, hackers are innovating ways to ensure data self-determination, including data trusts that are controlled collectively by citizens. So that hardly does justice to that whole constellation of quite profound, I think, principles which are essential for ensuring that our democracies are preserved in the digital era. And unfortunately, these principles are not well known to the ordinary public, but they ought to be known by technologists. And I think increasingly they're becoming known by other kinds of professionals that are working in this space, because certainly, as I said before, blockchain projects tend to be multidisciplinary. So I want to leave you with a concrete example. And I just pulled one off of your own website. And forgive me if I make any wrong assumptions about it. So let's just say I've pulled the initial idea from the website and turned it into a hypothetical. And so this is the hypothetical is a blockchain ID for the downtown East Side population. And I'd just like to leave you with some questions to think about when looking at this type of a project. How well does the project meet the hacker principles of privacy, transparency, net neutrality, free software, and common space production, anti-monopolization, and data self-determination? How well does it meet professional requirements? How well does it meet democratic principles? So for example, I'll just run through some of these questions for you and leave you thinking about them. Does the research ethics requirement for experiments with human subjects, has that been met? Has individual subject consent been attained? Is the input and consent of the entire population required? If this project were to be imposed, would it respect democratic processes? Would it be a system that was imposed by fiat or by regulation, or by a full-blown legislative process where it can be debated in the legislature and its full impacts perhaps better studied? This project is predicated on the idea that people on the downtown East Side often have difficulty keeping hold of their identity documents. Either they lose them or they could be stolen, and then they have difficulty getting services. So if you didn't have paper or cards, what would you be using? Would you be using a biometric identifier or some RFID under the skin? And that perhaps combined with remote sensing and recording. And of course, as soon as you get into this realm, these are highly privacy and autonomy, highly intrusive methods in terms of privacy and autonomy for the individual. There's the question of what kind of personal data or data history would be collected and linked. Over what time period would you be collecting individuals' history of everywhere they went in the downtown East Side, every service they accessed? Would all of those be linked? Would all that information be linked? Would you be using algorithmic decision making so that when somebody presented or walked through a sensor gateway, would an algorithm be deciding whether they got access or not, or what entitlement they got? Would the algorithms be making inferences about risk, for example? Would the algorithms be set up for machine learning so that that becomes a greater and greater concern when you have algorithms and machine learning, that you're not necessarily providing or even able to provide the transparency that a democratic system or a system that respects individual rights has. Yes, and if you use algorithms, machine learning, or automation, how will the decisions be communicated to the subject of the decisions, which is a concern of due process? Will the system use free software and be open to study, modification, and sharing? Is the system in the control of the users, that is the downtown East Side population? And if not, who has practical control of it? Will monopoly tech companies be involved? Could the community create its own systems and make them interoperable with the tested program or the government program? Will the system entail automated access to spaces and entitlements versus human discretion? And will the ID be linked to compliance And if so, what regimes? And you can imagine that it would be very tempting for government to link a blockchain digital ID with compliance regimes in the justice system, social service system, family court, even city bylaws and public health. And here's an ethical question, perhaps from a social worker's point of view. Will these automated decisions and treatment of the individual displace the human relationships they have with social workers, caregivers, and the kind of co-decision making that's supposed to take place within those realms? Will there be rights of appeal from decisions? How will statutory personal data protections be met? And those classically include notice that data is being collected to an individual, the purpose of collection always being stated and defined very specifically and not open-endedly, that there be a right of access and correction for the individual, that there be at all times secure storage, and that when the data, the purpose of the data has been fulfilled, it is deleted on a regular basis. And finally, I think, and this is quite a profound democratic question, is how with these kinds of systems do you avoid function creep, especially when you're dealing with a vulnerable population that is constantly engaged with state agencies? So I just leave you with that, because I think all those questions just start to broach the danger of blockchain, digital automated systems in society. Because what starts out to be a fairly simple idea of building a digital version of something that we have in the analog world, or that is, partially like a driver's license. It's a piece of paper connected to a very discrete single purpose or restricted purpose database. There's sort of an explosion of potentialities once you start creating it as a full-on digital system with blockchain technology in particular. So that's the end of my talk, and I look forward to having a discussion with you. Thanks very much.
Maureen, thank you so much for those insights. And I have to say, for me, this is one of the most inspiring and thought-provoking talks that I've heard in a while, simply because I agree with, what I think you've implied, if not explicitly stated, that our deliberations about the development of many new technologies, but including blockchain technology, really haven't grappled with some of these fundamental issues of principle and ethics and human rights and all of the principles, the hacker ethics that you've underscored, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I really I find it wonderful to highlight the need for deeper thinking and research on these issues. So thank you, and thank you also for running through a very worked example of how this thinking can be applied to an actual project, which we had as a blockathon for social good. This was, oh gosh, yeah, how many years ago? 4 or 5 years ago now, when we first founded blockchain at UBC. And indeed, the purpose of our blockathons for social good is not just to spin up designs and prototypes, but to really look at what we are building holistically in terms of, we think of our technology in terms of social, informational, technical systems. And so all of these issues that you've raised are of deep concern and should be of deep concern. So I just, fangirl here moment. to give people time to formulate their questions. And I do see that we have one question in the chat, but I'd like to invite people to write more questions or comments in the chat and to raise your hands also if you prefer to speak your question. So the question from Connor here is, for you, Maureen, is do hackers not face the problems and criticism of vigilante justice? Does it allow for the subversion of the socially agreed upon conventions for conflict resolution because an individual feels justified in rejecting these conventions? Following that, to what extent can hacking and hackers be regulated so that we can get the benefits of hacking without the costs? So I don't know if you have any thoughts for how to kind of grapple with that, that issue.
Yes, I do. Thanks for that question. It's an important one. And in fact, I have a whole chapter on that in my book called The Risks and Value of Transgressive Acts. And being a lawyer, of course, I find that question fascinating because the value of transgressive acts in a society, which include anything from, civil disobedience to sabotage to general strikes, there's the rich tradition of that in democracies, and it's really how we have achieved some of our most important social change, whether it's the abolition of slavery movement, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, all the big ones that have created major and now generally perceived as good social change, started with people bucking the system and breaking unjust laws or challenging unjust regimes. And so I see hacking very much, it's certainly progressive hacking. Now, and what I would admit is that there's a whole spectrum of acts, from the clearly malign to the very altruistic in hacking. And I think how we treat those legally and socially will, there'll be a dialectic involved that will help to determine, many of these complex questions that we're talking about in society around digital technology. So, do we treat things as pranksterism and mischief, or as civil disobedience, or as, hackers will often do things to show major flaws in a system. For example, the Chaos Computer Club, played with systems to show that there were major security holes in, for example, what was it? It was the routing system, an early routing system that had a monopoly, and they managed to use it to steal emails and to take money out of one of the major banks, which they replaced the next day. But they kept telling government that it was wrong to have this monopoly, and that the system itself was flawed. They weren't listened to, and then so they did this prank, which illustrated the flaws in the system. They did another famous hack where they were challenging digital electoral voting systems. And they said they could make the system that the German government was using play chess. And then they went ahead and they made it play chess. And that convinced the German government and also the Dutch government to do away with electronic voting and to go back to analog voting. And the Chaos Communication Camp was thanked in the EU Parliament for their input on that, and were lauded for saving the German electoral system. So, and while I was at the Chaos Communications Camp, in fact, there were some journalists that were being accused of treason, which is the highest crime of all. So, there's this whole range of hacker acts and a whole range of legal labels that could be applied to them. and how we prosecute them or tolerate them will determine a lot of these questions over the next century. And by no means would I say that any of these questions are easy. All of them have their own thorny, specific issues, and will take a lot of experimentation and deliberation to work out. But I think that the leaven or the genius that hackers bring to the equation through much of that spectrum is their technical ability, their creativity, and their social conscience, their interest in how technology affects society, and their willingness to push the envelope or go out on the limb, like early social movements did, and play with that area of transgression and change. So that would be my answer.
Thank you, Maureen. I mean, I guess, for me, it sounds like you're talking about the white hat hacker who is, maybe stepping outside the bounds of, what might be the rule of law in any particular jurisdiction, but is essentially a morally good, ethical being. But we do have, black hat hackers who really, we might identify as like those sociopaths in society that really do not either recognize that they're causing harm or care, so I guess I still feel like there's this unresolved tension which Connor has identified. I mean, yeah.
Well, no, I agree with you. I mean, and in fact, cybersecurity and cyber warfare are areas that I touch upon in my writing, but certainly I think some acts of hacking could be prosecuted as serious crimes. And we have a lot of existing crimes that could be applied. There's also cyber crimes that have been defined since the 1990s. But I think it also speaks to what is going to be, as everything becomes digital, it speaks to the complexity of our societies and the fragility of them. And I wonder, in fact, whether we need to be making some choices about what we turn into digital systems and what we keep non-digital, or how we build resilience into systems so that if they're not centralized, so that if one goes down, all of them don't go down. And so what I foresee is that there will be a constant arms race, if you will, between states and security experts and those that would breach security, either enemy states or bad hackers, and along with that sort of arms race will come decisions about whether we really need to go all digital or centralized with many of our critical infrastructure.
Yeah. So I guess, this touches on the second question that Connor put to you, which is the hacking and cyber warfare have been especially important in the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And he's asking, how do you see hacking impacting foreign relations and warfare? I would ask a corollary question and, look at our response to maybe hacking and how it's impacting foreign relations, and look at how hacking has recently impacted our own domestic politics in the context of the Freedom Convoy and our reaction to that. So I think we've got two kind of like interesting contrasts here, and I'd be interested to hear from you on your thoughts on these two events.
Yeah. Well, as I said, cyber warfare is, cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, for example, is one one whole area, and it's not the focus of my expertise or research, but except to make the comment that I made is how do you build more decentralized infrastructure, and how do you perhaps not turn everything into a target, an easy target, by making everything complex and digital where you don't have to. For example, elections, right? Voting systems. I think there's becoming a general consensus that voting systems that are digitized actually increase the risks versus, paper ballots that are hand counted, which seems to be an extreme analog poll, but it's the one that is the safest and securest. When it comes to disinformation, disinformation, misinformation, and now this new very concerning term, malinformation. I've had the opportunity since writing this book to do a number of talks. I did one at the Gray Center, or the Gray Area in San Francisco, which you might look up. It was like a 90-minute talk, and I dealt specifically with the ideas of that question arising out of the Cambridge Analytica experience, and then all the government responses in terms of trying to find algorithmic or various kinds of fact checking, and ultimately most of the responses tend towards censorship, which I think is the wrong remedy. And I also did an interview that was published by the Berlin Goethe Institute in their new magazine. So you might look those up. But I think that, again, our information environment is just complex now. And I don't think that we should be trying to necessarily find technological means to remedy that. I think it's somewhat unfortunate that it's become so complex, but I think that our politics and our civic spaces really cannot be fixed with technical means or censorship. And in fact, we need to dig down to our most basic Western liberal democratic beliefs and live them in earnest and uphold them in earnest if we're going to save our democracies at all in this maelstrom of complex information environments. And that includes, just the simple analog act of speaking to people you disagree with or that hold diametrically different views than you do. Running for office, showing up in physical spaces like school boards and community centers to debate issues with your local community. I think that's the only way that we are going to recover our very imperiled civic space. And I am definitely against censorship, which is a fairly detailed discussion that I don't think we have time for here, but I would direct you to those two other events that I've done purely on that topic.
Yeah. So I again, kind of bringing it back to a specific example that you mentioned in your talk about digital identities and kind of reputation, because I do and I have encountered in some fora in which I'm participating discussions about decentralizing identities and creating trust in identity-based systems, not on the basis of our traditional mechanisms of institutional trust, like let's say in government, assuming you do trust government, then basically building a reputation-based system, which is usually based on identifying a set of metadata that would define the parameters of your reputation, and then building an algorithm that would compute that. And So I'm assuming that, based on your remarks, you have some concerns about that kind of an approach. I've seen it very much in the context of combining AI and blockchain. Various.
Yeah. I think I would probably the kinds of projects that I might support would be fairly limited in that area. I know that hackers very early started playing with ideas like kind of alternative banking systems or alternative credit systems where, say you had a failed state and you didn't have a secure or competent means of getting banking services or perhaps even having identity documents, and so that you'd have something that was very localized, right? So they would be automated communities of trust based on sort of the Ethereum model of smart contracts and executing smart rules. And I guess, if you could do micro banking and you could base people's eligibility on their past contribution to that system. And so it's something very localized, right? So it's a small community of trust, but created virtually. But the more that I read about these new systems that seem to be inexorably on the horizon, like open banking or a universal digital ID, I get very concerned because, for one thing, like with these open banking systems, which give access to your banking information to third parties, and in all kinds of circumstances, they're deciding whether you have the credit that they're willing to accept. That allows third parties and algorithms to go through the minutia of your entire banking history, potentially, right? Because the technology allows it. It's not like walking down to the corner to your bank manager and asking for a letter of reference, based on your 5 years of dealing with them. So, I think there's a tendency for people that are not privacy experts in particular to treat all ideas as somewhat in the same ballpark, but the devil is so much in the details. And so, what could seem like a simple replacement for an analog version could be exponentially different and more intrusive. Just because of the way the technology works, or because you haven't thought through certain mitigations. And then, these universal digital IDs, I know that in Canada, I've seen a video where it seems that the Canadian Banking Association has been tasked with developing a system that they call a federated ID system. And they seem to be talking like hackers, and that it would be a decentralized system. So there would be a bunch of interoperable systems, so that you'd have, maybe healthcare and government and e-commerce and financial services and travel and maybe smart city apps that would all use a central portal, but would only be, they'd be like modular. And you could, they would only be able to access the information that they were entitled to, not the whole thing. But it still troubles me that you would have a single portal, because that becomes, the panopticon portal through which you could have an absolutely totalitarian social credit system implemented, And then finally, I would just comment, Max Blumenthal, who's a labor writer that I follow, he's a journalist who follows a lot of labor issues. He wrote an article on sort of the genesis of these ID systems, and apparently they're more far advanced in India and in some of, I think Lithuania has one. So some of these social experiments are actually being implemented. And you know, there's all kinds of just practical glitches that can happen, so that you know, he starts the article with stories of these peasants that starve to death because there's some glitch in the system and they can't get their ID to work, right? And because the whole system has been automated and there's no human beings in it, or there's very inefficient access to human beings, you can't sort things out when they go wrong. And I think that's another unintended implication of some of these systems. So yeah, I would agree with you.
Yeah, I think there's I'm just noting that we're even past the time, but I would even you probably have thought about this, you know, the central bank digital currencies and the implications of having programmable money and the potential for social control. You know, there's that we do have to think, as well as the capabilities and opportunities that these technologies bring, of the potential you know, issues relating to individual human rights and equality and freedom. And so I thank you so much for bringing your research, your insights to us today, you know, in terms of these extremely important issues that need to be considered as we work towards innovating in these technical spaces, and that we should be thinking about, as we do innovate, these implications. And so I would love to have you back. I would love further dialogue with you. So thank you again for taking the time. You must be incredibly busy with everything going on these days. So thanks for sharing your time with us. And we will, for those in attendance, thank you for participating. We will be making the recording available. And I urge you to read Maureen's book and listen back to the recording and bear these comments in mind as you develop your technologies. So thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you again, Maureen.
Thank you, everyone.
Next time. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.